In today's episode, we discuss how to condition your mind to embrace the difficulties and crosses of your life with strength and peace. We learn how these practices help you become more focused in prayer and get more out of each day. And finally, we discuss how to be a better man that others want to be around and you like being. We are joined by Harvard professor, Dr. Kevin Majeres. Stay with us.
Welcome to another episode of The Catholic Gentleman. We're so glad to have you with us. I'm Sam Guzman, and my co-host John Heinen is joining us as well. And today we are excited to have Dr. Kevin Majeres with us, who has a wealth of experience and knowledge that he's going to share. But before that, I'd like to invite you to subscribe on your podcast player of choice. As well as if you're watching this on YouTube, click the subscribe button so that you can get our content on a regular basis. And then lastly, if you've benefited in any way from our podcast, please consider joining our Patreon community. There's many other men already a part of that community, and there's different tiers of support that can just kind of match your situation. But producing high quality content like this isn't free, and we really appreciate your support. So please visit us at patreon.com/Catholic Gentleman and consider donating. So today we're joined by, as we said, Dr. Kevin Majeres. Thanks so much for being with us, Dr. Kevin.
It's great to be here, guys. Thanks for having me.
All right. So as we said, Dr. Kevin is a professor at Harvard Medical School and has been teaching there for the past decade. He specializes in teaching cognitive behavioral therapy to psychiatrists and training at the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. And he's trained in medicine and psychiatry. He got his degrees from the University of Texas Southwestern Medical School in Dallas. And he completed a fellowship in cognitive behavioral therapy at the Beck Institute in Philadelphia. And he also maintains a private practice. So it's hard to think of anyone more qualified to talk about what we're going to talk about today. But it just has to start things off. What really inspired you to get into psychiatry? And what is that practice like for you on a daily basis? I think we all have stereotypes about psychiatrists that may be more or less accurate. And there's just kind of a popular mystique around psychiatry. Mm-hmm. But really, what does the day-to-day look like for you, and what inspired you to get into the field?
Well, yeah, there's a lot I could say there. First, I will say just in case anyone from Harvard is listening, I'm technically a lecturer. So and I do that part-time. And my other work, as you mentioned, is having a private practice in psychiatry and then running Optimal Work. So I'm one of the co-founders of OptimalWork.com. And that's essentially how I divide my time. My psychiatric practice is the core of my week, I would say. And so that I do several hours most days of the week. I see working with patients as a kind of detective work in a sense. I'm asking myself the question always, what's the biggest challenge this person right now is facing and perhaps avoiding? And then how do I see how to start planting the seeds for flipping their view of that challenge around? That the very thing that they think there is fixed and somehow this is where their progress is stalled, that's where I try to introduce all the growth. So my specialty is in helping people with anxiety disorders. So usually the challenge is some form of anxiety, but the same principles apply really to any challenge that people could face. It could be anger, it could be cravings, could be whatever you would want. It's the same idea that it's the challenge we're avoiding that actually contains the deepest growth that we need and that will make us the happiest. So how do my work is helping people then to find new ways of approaching that challenge. So I find my work incredibly fulfilling and fruitful and not always easy, but it's at the same time, there's something deeply fulfilling when you can connect a person's challenge to what matters most for them in life. And suddenly they feel inspired by that connection. And that's probably that would be the highlight then of my clinical work, is actually helping people do that.
Yeah. Yeah. So turning obstacles into opportunities. That's your work in a nutshell.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly. So. Reframing. Essentially, I try to embody reframing. So, which is you take the thing that they have framed as some kind of limitation and obstacle and burden and purely bad, and you widen the context. So now they see this is precisely where they need to grow.
Yeah. No, and I appreciate that very much. And I do. I'm very fascinated by this, right? Because like you said, you broke it down from, kind of this high level to something that we all face, right? It's something that especially I feel in the Western world in modern times, this issue of anxiety, this overwhelming issue of desiring to control stuff, but then realizing we can't control it. And the harder we try, the more we realize the less control we actually have. And then that causes in this spiral of depression. What are some, I actually would like to, and we discussed briefly in show prep, what are some great stories that you have of people that have experienced that transformation? Generally speaking, what do we see, an individual struggling with, a very traumatic experience or something along those lines? Like, can we enter in just a little bit more concretely into some of the things that you practice?
Well, yeah, within the realm of anxiety, my specialty is helping people flip their view of adrenaline itself, which is actually what anxiety is. Okay. And so the people who have a phobia of adrenaline end up having, then anxiety disorders. So in fact, all anxiety disorders come from viewing anxiety as a disorder, and particularly from viewing adrenaline, which is a helpful hormone that lets you thrive on challenge and brings out your best performance, from viewing adrenaline as something negative. Okay, that's what all anxiety disorders somehow have in common. Now, the kinds of anxiety that I've helped people through varies enormously. One of the first cases I had right out of residency was a pilot who was grounded by the FAA because he fainted while flying a plane. And the reason he fainted is because his co-pilot told a story about a dental procedure gone awry where a stream of blood shot out of his mouth. And the pilot, in envisioning a stream of blood, passed out on the spot. So he came to me asking, basically what had happened. And this is a very primal kind of reaction that comes from your threat detector. But the threat there isn't even something he's conscious of. It's something his body has identified as a threat without his conscious mind even knowing. And it's the loss of blood to the brain. And then your body responds that when it thinks you're losing blood, like say, for instance, you're having blood drawn and then you pass out, that's why. You actually have an unconscious phobia that you don't consciously possess it, but it's there in the body. And what it does is when it thinks you're losing blood, it forces you to lie down flat. So the brain gets perfused with blood on the same level as the heart. So the exposure therapy for him was very bloody because we had to actually do bit by bit exposure to getting blood drawn. But it proves the principles perfectly, that you have to take the thing that the person is afraid of or that their threat detector, even without their consciously having a role in it, has identified as a threat, and you gradually expose them to it. You help them to face up to it. And so the deep truth in every kind of psychopathology is that all psychopathology, this is one branch of psychiatry, this is the way we think, all psychopathology comes from having a way of responding to triggers that sensitizes you to those triggers. So you become more triggerable in the future. So then the therapy tries to do its work of getting you to learn a way of responding when triggered that desensitizes that trigger. That's as far as it can boil down into the most simple thing. But the normal things are people have panic attacks, and they feel like they can't go on a plane. They're afraid of flying. In my experience, the fear of flying is actually fear of having a panic attack while on a plane and not being able to get off it. And so, but people there aren't, it's not really that they're afraid of flying per se. They're afraid of their escape being thwarted. And that's the essence of panic disorder or agoraphobia when it gets bad. It's super treatable. With really good therapy, you can help people in 1 or 2 sessions to make the flip. You flipped it, where now instead of trying to minimize the triggering, they actually seek to welcome it maximally with a wide open, bring it on, the more the better. That's the essence. That's like, if there are 2 sentences that teach people the path out of any anxiety disorder, it's bring it on, the more the better. The more they welcome their adrenaline and their anxiety, the more they see that it shrinks. It's only big when you run from it. When you turn to warmly embrace it, reestablish a kind of rapport with your own self and your own body. Don't fear your own reaction or thoughts. Let it come. You do that, and it's incredibly liberating, and it can be very quickly liberating. Because the great thing with anxiety disorders is that the more your anxiety is triggered in a moment, the more shapeable you are at that very moment if you turn and embrace it. So people who have higher anxiety get better faster. So I love treating anxiety disorders, because if you can bring on if you can do anything that would bring your anxiety to go higher, that is the royal road to freedom. Welcome it, lean into it, and it will quickly go away. And the higher it goes, the faster it is.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. So that's powerful. I mean, this idea of, embracing your fear, or embracing at least the adrenaline. I think, the panic attacks coming from not actually giving yourself permission to feel that feeling. There's something in you resisting that feeling, and that's what actually triggers the panic attack, not the adrenaline itself.
Exactly.
That's absolutely fascinating. So now someone may say, okay, fear of flying, you can avoid that pretty much just by not getting on a plane, right? And there's also a little kind of a spectrum of anxiety disorders where you have something like fear of flying, which might be kind of in the middle somewhere. But then you might have something like, let's say, PTSD, where somebody is severely traumatized by something that happened to them as a kid, or maybe, even prolonged, continuous trauma. Let's say they had an abusive parent or something like that. So how do you handle more difficult cases where there's like complex trauma or more severe anxiety that's more deeply rooted? Are the principles the same, or do you take a different approach?
So the principles are the same, because the threat detector, the amygdala, is the same.
Yeah.
And your amygdala's job was to detect threats when they are approaching, sound the alarm, which is what you get as adrenaline and what people call anxiety. Really, it just helps you to fight or flight if you need to, or actually perform better if you need to. And then it watches your response, looking for signs of approach or avoidance. And if it sees you approaching the supposed trigger, the threat, then that teaches it that this actually isn't so much a threat, and you have safety learning. And if it sees you avoiding the supposed trigger or threat, then it says, oh, he thinks or she thinks that this actually is a real threat, and then it learns that even more. And that's called threat learning or sensitization. So I try to emphasize the physiology here, because it does give us the clearest way forward, to understand what is happening with anxiety. So every anxiety disorder actually can be defined by what is the trigger, or what is the supposed threat. And for PTSD, it is a memory. So that's really like a phobia of your own memory. With panic disorder, it's a phobia of your own alarm system. With generalizing anxiety disorder, it's a phobia of your own catastrophic thoughts. With obsessive compulsive disorder, it's a phobia of an irrational thought. With scrupulosity, it's a phobia of some thought against morality. every single anxiety disorder is simply distinguished not by the mechanism of anxiety and how you work with it, but only by the trigger itself. And some triggers that had been more chronic, in the end, we just have to be very understanding with how threatening they can feel. And we have to really assess, is there actually still a threat present? So if there's a complex trauma from an abuser who's still present, that's going to be different than someone who is having flashbacks from a car accident that was a year ago and now is afraid of driving because they don't want to remember the car accident.
Yeah.
So everything he does has to be treated in its own case. I like to really emphasize the commonality of all anxiety. That it is still like, if you're anxious, it's because your threat detector is detecting a threat that may or may not be real. If it's not real, then approaching the supposed the threat is going to produce safety learning. And in fact, it is safe. But you have to make a judgment. And sometimes people really do need to work with a therapist to help them to make that judgment. So that's where it's like, yes, you may in some cases really need someone who's going to help sort out what's the real threat here and what isn't.
Yeah. I think that's excellent. I appreciate you sharing that with us. And so for our listeners, Kevin is a devout Catholic as well, and he's able to uniquely connect a lot of these things to kind of, how God built us and how God made us and the things that we can control. And I want to take a moment here and switch a little bit to something that I've heard you talk about, and that's the issue of this neuroplasticity, or, the brain being malleable, right? Because we as Catholics, growing in virtue, good habits that we're trying to form and things of that nature. And we can apply that practice to what we're talking about with these issues of anxiety. And so getting a little bit more practical, I'd like for you to talk about reframing. I'd like for you to focus, some time here and talking about how, one of the first things to control anxiety, because I know a bunch of our listeners are listening now and they're like, oh yeah, I have a lot of anxiety, but it's not, blood transfusion or flying or, a lot of trauma. It's just, I struggle to talk to a lot of people in a social environment, or, I might struggle to, have a conversation even with my family in which a hard question is going to be asked about, something within the Catholic faith, and I don't have the answers for it. And, and we just start building all these different possible ways for anxiety. But regardless of what your focus on anxiety is, I think I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that neuroplasticity, its relationship to God, and then a little bit about reframing, your approach here in this cognitive behavioral therapy, and how individual men can apply that to their everyday life in this, growth and holiness.
Yeah, that's a great question, great topic. I think when we're helping someone to reframe a challenge that right now they're currently being faced with or facing, and that they might see as a threat, what we want to do is to help them to see it as an opportunity for some kind of learning, growth, or practice. Asking the question, how can this bring out the best in you? Now, that question adapts itself to each individual and his or her circumstances. So that the question, how can this bring out the best in me right now, is like asking the question, in what way is this the perfect challenge for me right now? But I've found working with tons of people that, in fact, the challenge that they're facing right now is perfect for them. And how do you explain that? Why is it always that the challenge right now is exactly what you most need? Well, partly it has to do with, on our, from our perspective, if something is challenging for us, if there's something that we're likely to complain about and dread, well, it's because it right now is challenging. It's because it's not easy. It's because that's actually where we need to grow. If it were easy for us, there wouldn't be growth awaiting us there. So the things that come easily no longer count as challenges because we've already grown into those habits. So the challenge is actually the edge of the growth that we have in the habits, that we're trying to forge. So if you're thinking, how can this bring out the best in me? How is this really the perfect challenge? What that's also then getting at is there a providence behind every challenge? And is there a way that I can, is this challenge actually, can it have a new light through the operation of faith in my mind? So how does faith relate to challenges? And I think it relates to them by precisely giving the widest possible context for growth that you could have, for giving so in any single challenge, faith actually can show you how this makes sense as the will of God for your sanctification. This idea that this is the will of God, your sanctification. That means that whatever is happening to you right now is the best plan for your sanctification. So we are always facing the choice between two ends. One is self-satisfaction, and the other is sanctification. And everything in us actually serves one of those ends necessarily. These are the two masters. So self-satisfaction is the same thing, I believe, as covetousness, the sense of forming an idol, out of our own desires, so that, we want them to be fulfilled and will sacrifice anything for them, versus being willing to sacrifice any satisfaction for the goal of our sanctification. So at every moment, we're actually faced with the question, what sacrifice will we make? Which is like asking, what idol or God will we serve?
Yeah.
What is going to reign in us? And we choose in every moment a life dedicated to self-satisfaction or a life dedicated to sanctification of ourselves and others. So in ourself, then, is our own growth and holiness. And then with others, it's our bond with them and our service to them. So all of that is just the work of charity. So in some way, faith lets us see every challenge in the light of charity. As the best way I can respond here is the way that it actually bring out the love of God the most in my life right now. And therefore, I'm willing to sacrifice self-satisfaction for the sake of sanctification. So in the end, the best use for any challenge, is to embrace it as a means of attaining sanctification.
Wow.
So that when you feel anything in you, now, at least imagine that a person, has some addiction and they feel the pain of the craving. Okay, now that craving will either, when it gets really triggered, that will either accomplish the work of purgation in them if they lovingly embrace it and say, bring it on. The pain, that exactly is what I need to purge me. That's actually the most secure way then of being on the path of sanctification. Because if you can love the craving, you will not act on it. You only act on it to make it stop, to go away, for the purpose then of satisfying yourself. So in that case, then you lose the chance of having this deep purgation, and then you're more enslaved to it again. But that willingness is actually in our power. Reframing then lets you see things in the widest context. It brings in, what are the lasting ways that we want to grow? That was quite a lot for me to say.
That was very powerful, and it's very contrary to the temptations of the world in the flesh, right? I very much appreciate the approach that you're taking there. And I imagine that this is something that doesn't happen in one day. I imagine that this is the work of a lifetime to refocus your thoughts and your attention, and reframing as such, so that you can really embrace, and it's a different approach that you're bringing up here, because I hear, St. Teresa of Avila and these St. Francis of Assisi and these individuals that just embrace their suffering, and for our modern minds, that's kind of really so hard to do. And, but when you kind of put that positive, like accepting the challenge, if you will, on it, and I think that can definitely appeal to the hearts of men. So,
yes. And it can be in one day, but people shouldn't be surprised if it's not. But because I think the idea here is that you have to see that the craving itself or the anxiety itself is the cross, is the cure. You, every time you experience a craving and you love it and you offer it and you enter into it as a cross to be stretching yourself on it, and to make a loving offering of it, that loving sacrifice, that is a total victory.
Yeah.
And every time you have that opportunity, you have to take it. So, and if it seems like it is especially the worst time to have a craving or anxiety, then precisely that is the best time. Because first you make easy progress when, where it's easy, low-hanging fruit. But then there are times when you're going to be more on edge, you're going to be more tested in various ways. And then you're going to have what seems like exactly the worst moment to have a craving get triggered or to have anxiety get triggered. Then you need to see this is even deeper growth. So the craving itself is the cure for the addiction. The anxiety itself is the cure for the anxiety disorder, if it is lovingly embraced.
Wow.
Now, that doesn't mean in the case of cravings that you go seeking them out. I think that gives a mixed signal.
Yeah.
But should they occur, unsought, the discomfort of the craving can be fully welcomed. So the discomfort is actually experienced in the chest itself. And that doesn't matter, I believe, if it's a craving for, cocaine or for, whatever the drug or experience might be. The real craving is actually experienced as a tension in the chest, just like anxiety. So when it comes to the discomfort of anxiety or cravings, it's that there is a high signal coming from your salient systems, and it wants to know that you understand that there is an opportunity here that you need something you need to flee if it's a threat, or something you need to take if it's a craving. If you don't let that system know that you got the message, it will increase it and increase it and increase it. If you are wide open to feeling it, you welcome the discomfort, you let it be there. In fact, what happens is the whole signal then runs its course much more smoothly. So people make things difficult for themselves by dreading the triggering and by distracting themselves when they actually start to have the anxiety or the craving. So in fact, you have to be prepared to welcome the discomfort as the shaping that it is. With cravings, it's actually very interesting. I think that this is tied into a different system, which is also dopamine. So what's happening when people are having a powerful craving is all that means is that there is a pleasure circuit in their dopamine system that right now needs reinforcement quick, or it's going to be degraded and your dopamine will be assigned to other things. Well, so it can feel urgent. It can feel painful. People can get restless. Great. The more that's happening, the more dopamine reassignment will take place. All you have to do is love the fact that that's happening. So, and love the discomfort that comes, as it is, the more you love it and embrace it, it is a quicker path then to reassigning those dopamine circuits. And love will make you deliberate and mindful so that you do not act automatically. Being in threat mode, being caught up in dread, hating the experience is going to make you more likely to automatically act on it without even thinking. But love makes us deliberate. Love can slow down the experience, slow down time, embrace the discomfort. But actually, that discomfort is the growth happening. Eventually, then, that circuit will have a stepwise degradation down, and a whole bunch of the dopamine fibers will be reassigned to other things. And then actually what that means is the rest of life becomes more enjoyable. Because that this addiction had ended up pulling dopamine circuits from where they should be. Like when you have mastery in your job, you should feel great about that. Well, that feeling great with a job well done, feeling great with a relationship that's stable, and happy, all of that is the daily dopamine that we need, that we're built to have. And unfortunately, addictions takes all of that out and then puts it into this one bucket. The craving is the reassignment of the dopamine circuit about to happen. It gets twitchy and irritable. If you just let that happen, love it happening, Then you have the stepwise degradation. And the next time is easier, and the next time is easier, and the next time is easier.
Awesome.
Yeah, well, that's some really powerful stuff there. A lot to meditate on, as you know, and in the way you're describing it, it almost sounds like so much simpler than we make it sometimes. But actually, what you're saying, a lot of it corresponds to a lot of the things that you read in the saints. Like, for example, St. John Vianney, I remember this quote from him. The greatest cross is the fear of crosses. And he talks about how if you can get over that fear of crosses, then things are so much easier. Like if you just embrace those crosses, which is almost exactly what you're saying in different terminology, it's the resistance to the resistance that trips us up so often.
Exactly.
And so I guess I'm wondering though, like I've seen a lot in Catholic circles, and I don't want to knock it too hard because in one sense I understand it. But like I see a lot of times where people say, I'm depressed, I'm severely depressed, I have a serious anxiety disorder, maybe my relationship is on the rocks, maybe I have all these past memories that are plaguing me. And what people say is, I don't need psychology, I don't need neurology, I don't need any of that stuff. That's all for the world. I'm just going to pray more. I'm going to go to adoration. I'm going to go to mass. I'm going to go to confession and pray my rosary. And 5-10 years later, they're still in the same cycles, but they're just going to try harder, just going to give it a little more effort. And I don't, like I said, I don't want to disparage this too much, because on the one hand, I understand it in the sense that we're told by all the elements of our faith that these things are powerful. They can be spiritual remedies. They can be remedies for us in different areas of our life. But we all know, like, and we've all seen in ourselves probably times when we've turned to these things and kind of in an effort to avoid dealing with other areas of our life. And so I guess would be interested in your perspective on people who kind of embrace this spiritual bypassing of their issues, or maybe who well-meaning but look down on things like cognitive behavioral therapy or psychiatry or any of those other methods that are available for healing.
Mm-hmm. I guess my first reaction is that maybe God is guiding them by other paths, and that I'm not going to be the one to say that can't work.
Yeah.
I believe that if one, it does in fact to say in the letter of James, is one among you sad, let him pray. He also says, that to let them ask for wisdom, and that God gives wisdom ungrudgingly. So if people were to truly be asking for wisdom, what wisdom does is clarifies continually the last end, which is, how are you able in this very action to prioritize your bond with God and others and your own growth? So, so you have the sense of pursuing the highest goods. If people truly pursued the highest goods, and were to ask themselves, like, how do I, while keeping this good in mind, really stretch myself in this and embrace that stretch? I think that is the kernel of all health and healing. If a person could be truly thorough and sincere in applying this, it would go a great, great distance. Now, there could be some cases like, I don't know, schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, where it's still there. You still might benefit from psychiatric care. But I think that it's true that for a lot of people, if they could learn in every action to ask themselves, how could this actually bring out the best in me? To have a clear image of that in their mind, to have their attention fully in the present moment, and then to specify somehow how they're going to stretch themselves to the sweet spot of stretching themselves in this next task. And then they do that hour after hour. I think actually that's incredibly transformative. All of cognitive behavioral therapy comes down to 3 skills. The cognitive part is about reframing, to flip your view, your attitude towards the current situation, to see how it actually is capable of bringing out the best in you. The second part is mindfulness-based approaches, which let you essentially recollect your attention fully in the present moment so that you are not dwelling on the past. I don't think you can sanctify the past by ruminating about it. I don't think you can sanctify the future by worrying about it. You can only sanctify the present by embracing the cross in the present moment. By looking at what I'm about to do, how do I do it in a new and better way that stretches me? And then challenge is the last part, which is the behavioral therapy. It's just you identify the stretch in what you're about to do. I built this into optimal work. This is my kind of universal approach to all psychology issues is optimalwork.com. The idea of that is you can actually develop these skills of reframing, mindfulness, and challenge in any situation, in any hour of work, or in any hour of life, really. All you need to do is pause before you do it for a few minutes and recollect yourself. But that can be a very thorough transformation of the entire person. I don't know how people would transform themselves if their resistance to CBT is because they have a fixed view of themselves, and they have a fixed view of the people around them, or they're blaming other people in their life. There is no system in which blaming others actually is going to work and make you feel better. So there's all these things where if people were truly sincere and had like the right intention, they could go very far. But it's hard because people they stop growing because they blame others. They fix their growth in some way. And it's hard to know when you're having your own fixed, limited concepts.
Yeah.
I want to actually continue on that thought process there. I've heard you talk about complaining and negative self-talk and or negative self-beliefs. But I've heard you discuss that we have to remove complaining from our lives. And you've even talked about, who is the primary beneficiary when we start doing that. And I'd really love for you to talk a little bit about the science and a little bit about the ways, in this reframing, but also the benefit or then even what complaining does to our mind, fixing us on the negative and then this sort of transformation that occurs, if you wouldn't mind, because I liked what you were just saying there. And I think that that's really important for myself. I know it's had a big, I have to constantly remind myself of this, like on a daily basis, prone to, negative thoughts or complaining and realize that I've conditioned myself.
So the essence of all anxiety and depressive disorders is a negative processing bias. Okay. And that's something measurable in the brain. And that means that the brain has a proclivity for negatively hued signals. Anything that seems negative, it could be like a sad face. It could be, so if you have a bunch of neutral faces and one sad one, the person actually knows the sad one faster. There are experimental ways of measuring the negative processing bias, not of quantifying it per se, but of showing, that to the extent the person can have this negative processing bias. When antidepressants work for anxiety or depressive disorders, they work by seemingly reversing the negative processing bias. So that is exactly what is at play when a person is complaining or reframing, because the negative processing bias begins in what's called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, or the appraisal center. When you have the detection of a threat or challenge coming up or nearby or right in front of you, your amygdala will start to light up, and it will be noticing that there's a challenge here. That does automatically reach up into your ventromedial prefrontal cortex and start to turn it down. As it turns down, your way of consciously framing or experiencing that threat will tend to go negative. But you can, at that moment, realize what's happening. So maybe what that means is you're about to give a presentation in front of a bunch of people, and you start right before the presentation is about to begin, you start to be like, you start to get a little bit nervous. Okay. But you could, at that moment, say, okay, this is just my system gearing up to give me adrenaline, bring it on. This is, and you would focus on the positive good you're seeking in this presentation. how you want to, it could be something in terms of like cooperating with the Holy Spirit. It could be speaking more clearly and enunciating clearly as a kind of very concrete thing to practice. Whatever it is, you have a positive goal you're aiming for. And then the adrenaline gets directed towards that goal and helps you to make it happen. What that would look like in a fMRI machine is that your ventral near prefrontal cortex would have started to go down as your amygdala activated, seeing the threat, but then you consciously reactivated it, which is what reframing does. You saw how this could bring out the best in you. And then with that appraisal center fully activated, your amygdala quiets down much more quickly and gives you exactly the right amount of adrenaline for the performance that you have. So you need adrenaline to perform at your best. It's a cognitive enhancer that makes your IQ go up. It makes your processing speed better, your verbal fluency. Everything is improved by adrenaline, as long as that appraisal center is turned on, which is that you're actually seeing it consciously, deliberately, as an opportunity for learning, growth, practice, something like that. So what complaining does is it's a way of voluntarily holding off that appraisal center. By dwelling on the negative and why you don't like this, and on what you're really unwilling to experience in this moment and why it's terrible, and you keep on on what you hate about it. That dwelling on the negative, well, unfortunately, it gets remembered by the brain. And the more you deliberately complain or deliberately let yourself voice the complaining, because complaining could be external or internal. It's worse if it's external, because that makes the negativity go viral and affect other people and turn off their appraisal centers too.
Yeah.
But at least even internally, you suffer from it. So that is anything you repeatedly do with your brain, it will make more efficient over time. And so if you train your brain, like the muscle of focusing on the negative, that actually gets your brain to be really good at locating the negative and then dwelling on it. You don't want to build up that muscle. The brain is the organ that is most responsive to your behaviors. And so you have to be aware of how you're shaping it. I don't believe that there are people who just have negative processing biases. But yes, everyone who develops a negative processing bias did it unintentionally. So they didn't set out to do it. But one way or another, either there was some threats that were looming that they couldn't get away from, and then they got just really good at always detecting them, or there's some experience they were unwilling to have that made them sad. And so they kept on dwelling on that. Either way, reframing is something always in your deliberate power. It's the precise opposite of complaining. Reframing takes threats and turns them into opportunities, positive challenges to be embraced. Complaining takes opportunities and turns them into threats as a kind of negative challenge to be avoided. So reframing, I think, is the most constant way we exercise faith, because you actually are just widening the context of the whole of life and all of eternity and seeing what you're choosing here and the reasons for choosing it brought into every action. So essentially, the meaning of your life is lived action by action throughout your day. But complaining, I see it as a kind of practical atheism that just shuts off all divine meaning. It shuts off the search for the divine in the present moment, and then encloses us within ourselves. So it creates a little hell within us, and then that can go outside of us too. So that's not to say that everything is that nothing bad happens on earth. It's not to say that there are things that are truly bad, and sometimes it helps to discuss those with people. If you're aimed at trying to see how this could actually bring out the best in you, what is the path here? Where's the divine wisdom? And you're consulting someone to talk about that. That's not complaining, because you haven't shut the door and just declared it negative bad.
Right.
So I think you do. So I'm not trying to, so sometimes people think that I'm trying to you can never admit something. No, but if you're getting stuck on seeing, you just can't see anything as good, something is good, or you can't really come up with any new strategy for growing in it, well, then talk to someone and share it with them and see if they can help you with strategies.
Yeah. I don't think I'll ever complain again after that.
No, that was really well stated.
I didn't even say how it shuts off your immune system. It shuts down the activity of your natural killer T cells and makes you more likely to get viral infections and potentially cancers. Complaining actually is the sense like it turns off your parasympathetic nervous system, which is what you need to have the full immune response and what you also need to have the full emotional health. So it turns down heart rate variability. So your heart ends up you actually are directly affecting the health of your heart by dwelling on the negative. Yeah. So there is something deeply wise about remaining lighthearted and cheerful no matter what events happen, and to have the kind of sense of becoming a child and accepting each moment by moment cheerfully, not carrying the baggage of the whole past with you, but trying to have a sense of like cheerful, grateful acceptance of all that happens. That does all the good psychologically and physiologically.
Yeah, that's so powerful. So just like even physically, our physical states, can be affected by those emotions. I want to go back to something you said that kind of jumped out at me, and you mentioned that reframing is always possible. And I do believe that's true. I always, I believe we have that innate awareness that is able to kind of neutrally observe our emotional states and things like that and choose to accept them or reject them. But I will say that sometimes that feels harder to access than other times. So an example would be, let's say someone has a really bad temper and they get triggered. Like you said, you mentioned the importance of triggers. They get triggered and they just see red. Like it just, something just takes over. And, maybe in a more, maybe if they're talking to their therapist or something like that, they could say, well, in this moment, I could actually decide to do this instead or something like that, or reframe the situation. But in that moment, when they're triggered, it's almost impossible to access that reframing capacity, or at least it feels impossible. And I can think of a lot of different situations like that, where someone might have a persistent struggle with something. And in that moment, it feels impossible to access that kind of neutral awareness that can help them make the right choice or reframe in the right way. So what's kind of a way that we can practice this so that in those moments when we experience those things that can be triggering, and we maybe feel that powerful emotion coming to the surface, and it feels like a tidal wave that's like very difficult for us to hold back, what are ways that we can access kind of this reframing capacity that you're describing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the first thing you have to do is pre-frame the triggering, to say like that you have to be ready you're going to welcome the discomfort of the triggering. You try to be ready to exercise curiosity in the very midst of the trigger. So curiosity is an attitude that is a reframe because it implies openness to what is happening right now, openness to what you're feeling. So curiosity is the simplest reframe. And it's just on the side of from neutral to slightly positive. So if a person were to be highly triggered, say with anger, and he would ask himself, okay, wait, how angry am I? It's a beautiful question. Make himself rate it on a scale of 0 to 10. If he were to rate it, he would not act on it. Because the moment you're turning the anger into something that you are aware of and measuring, you have already bounded it, and it is no longer a force impelling you to act. Instead, it is a finite emotion, which is more true, actually. So you experience then the anger as something. So now you are no longer subjected to it. It is now the object of your awareness. Well, that's the flip that curiosity does. So it flips you from being this is just subjected to some force to now making it the object of your measured awareness. Well, That's enough to get people through. And I've actually helped people who came to me very rapidly get over anger problems by helping them to see, one, they need to be curious the moment they notice it's coming. If they are noticing, because almost always in these cases, they were dreading it coming. Well, the dread is setting the stage for the blow up. You can't dread, the trigger, and then expect that you will have an easy time managing it when it comes, because the dread is treating the triggering as something really inherently evil. No, the triggering is precisely let's tell you a deep question. What is an emotion? It's not your destiny. It's not a force that determines how you act. The emotion that you experience when triggered is simply your brain's prediction of what you want to be doing at that moment. So with anger, there's a prediction that your brain is making that you will be wanting to fight. So it gears you up to fight. And that's what anger is. Or that you'll need to flee. You're going to try to flee. So that's what you experience then is anxiety. So anxiety and anger are practically identical in the brain. So they have different expressions in the face and and things, but in the brain itself, it's the fight or flight response. And it just means that your system is predicting you're going to want to flee or fight. Now, that is not some kind of wisely determined, from all, eternity prediction that is going to be true for you necessarily. So it's very foolish to just give in to emotions when they get triggered. They're just predictions. And if you give in to them, you confirm them and you make it more likely that it'll predict it again in the future. So by welcoming the triggering, you're doing the opposite. And now your system is open to learning very fast that, okay, our prediction was really wrong. He ended up not wanting to fight at all. In fact, instead of fighting, he went and gave her a hug and kissed her. Make your action when you're angry as opposite as you can. Be forgiving, be tender, be meek. If you react that way, in the moment of the triggering, you powerfully reshape expectations in your brain. Your brain doesn't like to make mistakes. So it will be working then very hard to make sure it doesn't make that same mistake again of predicting an action when it's not going to happen. This is, I believe, the most advanced neuroscientific theory of what emotion is, but it is so fully liberating for people. If you turn emotions into destinies, you are trapped in a self-fulfilling prophecy. If having anger means you have to act on it, having a craving means you have to act on it, you are building a prison of your own making. It is only a prediction your brain is giving you. It's not a trait. It's not the type of person you are. It's not what you have to be. None of that is true. So I'm also just concerned about people medicalizing every emotion as if, I just have this disorder, so I therefore have to give into it. No, the emotion is a prediction. And if you give into that a lot, yes, that prediction gets to be pretty powerful, and it generalizes and predicts it in more and more cases, and it spreads. But you can always turn it around. So reframing, mindfulness, embracing challenges are precisely how we restore freedom from these forces of self-fulfilling prophecies in our life.
Yeah. I have one final question, and that is breaking it down to a little bit more practical. One of our listeners, myself, I'm waking up tomorrow and I'm deciding today I'm not going to complain. What are some practical things that we can do to actually start that process, knowing that chances are we're going to fail, especially if it's, this negative bias is just so strongly built within us. But what are some things that you suggest individuals do to keep that front and center in their mind and memory?
I think that the best resolution you could make would be to cheerfully welcome the urge to complain whenever it shows up and see how many times in the day can you do that. We don't want to be anti anything. Reframing isn't anti anything. It's seeing the opportunity in everything. So the urge to complain is the setting for the victory and should be welcomed. And mindfulness isn't anti anything. It's actually, if you're being mindful of the urge to complain, you are opening up to feel that urge, not trying to make it go away. trying to make that urge go away is actually why you complain. You get the urge to complain and you give into it. So you only give in to things that you want to stop. So the more you have a mindful awareness of the urge itself, well, the better. And so the more times you can practice that in the day, the better. So the mistake people make is they think that having an urge to complain means that they're already defeated. No, that's when the reshaping occurs. That's when your appraisal center was shutting off and you deliberately caught it and then worked it back on. So by being cheerfully welcoming, being curious, trying to see, okay, what's the thing here that I could really dive into as an opportunity? So we don't want the sense that internal complaining thoughts are the enemy. No, that's going to be automatic and natural. You don't want to be anti-thoughts. You don't want to be anti-urges or emotions. Instead, you're going to try to welcome them when they occur. Let them be there. Don't struggle with them in your mind. Just welcome them, let them be there, and then identify what's the most beautiful way of growing right now. And the more times you could go through that in the course of one day, the better a day that would be. So the best day wouldn't mean you were never tempted to complain and that was a great day. No, you'd actually, it was kind of too bad. I was all ready to embrace it and to like welcome it. That in that sense, you'll see that, even everything that seems like the problem actually is part of the solution. If you're trying to be mindful and recollected, and then you get these distracting thoughts entering your mind, what you should do is, you essentially acknowledge them with an inner cheerfulness. You acknowledge them, gently let go of them, and then refocus on whatever you were attending to in the present moment. In the case of just purely human recollection, it could be the breath or the life in your body or your active being, and it could be also, the presence of God holding you up in being. It could be the presence of our Lord in the tabernacle. So those are the two real touchstones of presence in the center of our soul and in the tabernacle. And we can go back and forth, anchoring, using each as an anchor of our awareness. Well, then when a distraction occurs, great. Acknowledge it, let go of it, and re-anchor. And the more times you practice that, the more you're forging the salience, the power of attracting your attention of the present moment or God upholding it. And that's how you shape yourself. So you can dwell more and more in the present or in the presence of God. So I say all these things, like what seems like the bad thing is actually, no, that's the setting for the good thing. So that's, I think, the key insight here. And this is all in the way, the theology of the cross. What seems like the pain, in fact, is the gain if it's lovingly embraced as an opportunity.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. So powerful. I do want to ask one final question for myself too, because what you're saying is so beautiful, but I think in my experience too, even when I brought this at times, like loving acceptance, or I've sought to bring that to certain experiences in my life, I can attest, and I'm sure some of our listeners have too, that sometimes there can be a great deal of suffering involved in that, where like that desire to flee that suffering, or that desire to accept that suffering starts to, like, the fleeing impulse starts to get stronger, and the willingness to accept it and embrace it lovingly seems to get weaker. And especially with prolonged suffering, at first you can maybe start with the right intention. I'm going to reframe this. I'm going to welcome it. I'm going to accept it with a loving and curious attention or whatever. But then I don't know, days into it, or maybe less or longer than that, whatever. It just feels like I can't do this anymore. I'm struggling to suffer well. How can we develop our capacity for suffering? Because it seems like the key to everything, that you're saying is the ability to suffer well, to embrace it, to not flee from it, to not resist it, because that just undoes everything. So yeah, that's the question. How can we develop that capacity to suffer well?
I think that the biggest problem with suffering well is that there can be a lack of deep sincerity about what am I really seeking. And are we still in some hidden way seeking self-validation, self-satisfaction in some important aspect? Because if we have the most generous sincerity, in actually seeking the greatest goods, they do come to dominate our life. Another way of asking this question, in a sense, is there anyone for whom the purgative way lasts forever? And the answer to that has always been in church, no. So if you embrace the pain of the purgation, the more you fully embrace that pain and learn to love it, the faster you move through the purgative way. So that in some cases, the great masters say, a week might be enough, at some point in their life. But that's just actually, so it's a question of how fully is a person letting go of the hidden forms of self-seeking that are there, that they're somehow thinking, I'll embrace this suffering to a point, but then I have set this limit that no farther. That's unreasonable. Or I'll give up something to a point. But there's something there that is, I think, some kind of attachment, that is not being let go of. And that's precisely why they feel unfulfilled. And this is a very deep work of letting go of something. And it's also personal. But that process of letting go, once the person's behavior, is more and more shaped by some kind of ideal, they do tend to move out of the painful steps of purgation. I think we need people moving out of that stage more rapidly, not more slowly. And they need to be thinking of, how do you really get to the next stage, the illuminative, which is where you are now finding, in moment after moment, beautiful ideals to stretch yourself with and growing in every virtue. So that instead of just breaking vicious cycles, you actually, and focusing on stopping those vicious cycles, all of your life is starting to turn towards starting virtuous cycles, which is what happens when you learn how to pursue ideals. Now, those ideals, then you're looking for ways, how can I be, more, growing in a sense of order in my work and intensity in it and constancy in it, and looking through all these different things in life where in your, eventually it's all going to be in your relationships. How can I be more loving ultimately, with the people in my life and ultimately with God? So then eventually all this pursuing of ideals gets simplified. And more, it's just a question of, how can I love God with my whole heart right now? And finding ways to do that, finding the cross to be embraced. At every stage, there's the stretch of the cross, but then learning how to embrace that, not just to grow in a virtue now, but actually to grow in the bond with God. And that marks the unitive way, which is where everyone is called to be, spending their days in loving communion with God. So I don't think there's anyone who actually needs to be stuck in the first stages of the purgative way. It's the most painful stage. It's the most dangerous stage. The more they get, break decisively with the vicious cycles, get started on the path of growth. Eventually, I think they will all attain to the unitive if they persevere in that.
Yeah, I think
this has been a fantastic conversation. I've learned a lot.
Yeah, me too, Kevin. I know that I will be re-listening to this episode myself. Hopefully taking notes and growing in that holiness that you're speaking of. Really, that's obtainable for all of us. And so, for those listeners who won't have time to re-listen to this, where can they go to find more of your work and stay, consistently on top of what you're doing? Where would you point them? I'll be sure to put them in the show notes. We'd just like to hear a little bit from you and the work you're doing and where men can find you.
So my way of teaching all of this is optimalwork.com. So, and there I have a masterclass, which is a 4-week training program, so that people can do this training. It's about 15 to 20 minutes a day, for 4 weeks. The masterclass is my most complete going through all of this. The second kind of thing is the podcast that I have. So I always feel bad benching a podcast on a podcast. But,
no, please do.
We have
That's
a
what you're here
podcast called
for.
The Golden Hour. Yeah,
Yeah.
where Sharif Yunus, who's been a great friend and co-worker of mine for years now with Optimal Work, he invites me on, and maybe someday he'll invite other people on too, but for now it's been mostly me for the first 100 episodes, or entirely me. And those are like 20 to 30 minutes long, and they're all on some different topic. And it's always going to be it's all about the psychology of challenge. Yeah. So we don't supernaturalize that directly, but I think always you can take, whenever we say challenge, just think of the cross instead. That's like the Christian approach to challenges. That's the cross. And then, so the cross is the key, that when you put that in there, you'll see Optimal Work is actually the complete program for growing in all the virtues, including Wonderful. Faith, hope, and charity.
It's just excellent. Well, I'm so grateful for your time that you would give to us here, and that we'll be sure to put that in the show notes. All our listeners can find you. And sure, I've listened to the podcast many times, so I encourage our listeners to go forward and listen to that podcast as well. So, yeah, thank you again.
Thank you all so much for the wonderful questions. It was a great conversation here, and I wish you all the best in your work too.
Yeah, thank you. And so, as we like to end every episode,
be a man, be a saint.